Hello. So, my name is Megan, or Asa as I'm known online, and I have been requested to show some people how to do fur and how to shade fur. So, I thought I would do a little video on my process of shading and giving the basics of shading and throw in a little bit of, I guess, digital painting too, because it's digitally painted. So, I use SAI. I also use Photoshop, but SAI is cheap because it's only like $60 to buy it. And SAI's cool. There's also Krita if you don't have Photoshop. That's one that I have to figure out how to use. It's very nice, but I haven't figured it out yet. So, excuse my excessive sniffling. I have no idea why I do it. But I guess I'll start by showing you how to do a basic sphere and how to shade a basic sphere. Because that's how you start out with shading fur. You have to know how to shade basic shapes like a circle or a cylinder or cones. What I suggest if you want to practice is drawing these simple shapes, or the basic shapes, the cylinders and the cones and everything, and shading them, because once you know how to shade them, you'll know how to shade pretty much everything else, because everything is made up of these things. So like a cone, and you have, that's not a cone, that's a cylinder, and then you have a cone, which is like a tooth shape, and you've got spheres, of course, and cubes. It looks like my processor's hating me. Need to get a new one. So, basic shapes, and then you have this thing, I don't know what this is called, but one of my art teachers put it in. It's like a teething ring for kids. That's something that's interesting to shade. So yeah, you have the basic shapes, and the sphere is just one of them. But I'll go into the sphere because the sphere is kind of the basis of them all, besides the square. So, let's start with a new drawing. I'll just close this. Nah. I'll make a new one. Now, when you're doing digital art, you always want to start off with a large canvas at least 300 pixels per inch, because if you want to, like, do something with it later, you want it to be at a high resolution. And they begin with 75 pixels per inch, and you have to you have to change that, or else you're gonna have pixely drawings forever. I always start out with a square canvas and then cut it down to whatever I need, whatever the picture turns out to be, which is not what you should do when you're a traditional artist, because then you end up cutting your paper and you can't find a frame for it. So, that's one of the advantages of doing digital. But anyway, I start off with a large canvas, usually 3000 by 3000, 600 pixel resolution, and you have your canvas. And I never like to draw on white. I used to do it, but it killed my eyes. So, I've started doing this thing where I shade, put in some gray with the bucket tool, and that makes my eyes much happier, because it doesn't hurt. Should probably close some things. Let's see. I wonder if it's just the Flash player dying. It's been doing that a lot lately. I hate Flash. Let's see how this is doing. Yeah. we go. I've always had this problem freaking processors. But anyway, so start off with a gray canvas because it doesn't kill your eyes, and then use a layer on top of that. You can start out with a brush, you can start out with a pencil. Either way works. I usually start out with my stuff just with the pencil. I usually zoom in until the whole screen is taken up by the canvas too. And then you just start drawing. Sketchy circle. And I come from a basis in traditional drawing, so most of what I do is what I did when I was doing traditional. And a good way to practice this stuff is to just make a still life with like styrofoam stuff that you can find at the art store. You can find little styrofoam spheres and cubes or whatever, and you can put them together and make a drawing out of them, and that helps a lot. Drawing from life is one of the main things that helps you get better at drawing anything. So now we have the sphere, and this is the cast shadow. So now we're just getting into the basic parts of light. So here's the sun. This is where the light's coming from. And the light source is very important, because if it was over here, we'd start doing shading from over here. And if it was down here, it would be different. So with the light, you always want to have the highlight facing the light. So the light's probably more behind it, like this, but this gives you a basic idea. This is something you learn from observation. When you do still lifes or when you look at real life, you notice how highlights and how shadows work on things. It's just a matter of practice and observing. So this is where the highlight would be. And then you have your core shadow, which goes around here. So that's where the darkest of the dark is. And then you have my favorite part of the light, the reflected light, which is the light that's getting shot here and then bounced off the table. And it usually ends up looking really cool, and it's really hard when you get into color and you have to figure out reflected light, because that's confusing. I still haven't figured it out yet. So you have your sphere, and I'm gonna throw in a line for the background. This is exactly how I would start out a traditional piece too, with charcoal on paper or on newsprint. Newsprint's naturally this color. You also wouldn't have the gray with regular color. That's another advantage of digital. So now you have the basics. I think there's a mid-tone around here somewhere. I can't remember. But there you go. So I usually start out with the shade. I'm going to start using the brush, which has a texture on it. And I never start with black. I always go to a shade that's lighter than black, because that is something I was taught in art school, and so far it's actually been pretty useful. So you start with your shade color, and then you sort of draw in the shape that the circle would be in. You want your brush strokes to move along with the shape. And do sketchy lines. And you're starting out with the base too. So another thing that I usually do is I start with a large brush and then work my way to a smaller one, because the details are my favorite part. This part not so much, but I enjoy it. So, and the cast shadow is always the same darkness. Well, not always, but usually the same darkness as the core shadow, which is the darkest shadow in a shading thing. So now that's the one color, and I've been using really light touch. I use an Intuos tablet, so that's why I've got some nice sensitivity. Now here's the thing about digital painting. I don't ever go up here and choose another color, because there's already color mixed here. See, I can, well, I have a tool on my Intuos where I can just right click my little button on my pen and it'll change the color. See? You have the dark color, and then you have this lighter color, which is already blending with this a little bit. So with digital art, you can just take the colors like that and start working. And if it's too dark, like I think this is too dark, you can always take another sample from a lighter section of it and start painting that way. I still think it's too dark, so I'm gonna try there. So there's a mid-tone. Now when you're doing color, everybody always tells you to start out doing a mid-tone, which is the neutral tone. And neutral means that it's got gray in it. It looks duller. Not duller, it's just the middle tone, the tone that sort of affects all of the other ones. And when you start with the neutral, you can start shading with your shade color, or you can do it however you like. I usually start with the shade. So there's the mid-tone, and we're not getting into blending yet either. We're just trying to keep the lines sort of following the shape. Now here you've got the dark and then the mid-tone dark. And then I would add this highlight here. The whitest white. Maybe not that white. I never want to use pure white either. Especially on a toned picture, because that looks really, really sharp. So I did the same thing there where I took a light color and I just changed the color. I never went over here. I never try to do that. After you pick your basic palette, like this dark color and then this light color, and then you can choose like 2 or 3 more in between, I always just use the blending that comes naturally from the blending of the colors in the program, and just take colors from that. Because when you go all over the screen, you get like weird colors and they never match, and it just ends up looking really not cool. At least from my experience. So here I'm going to take that grayish light color again and start going around, making the highlight brighter. See how I'm going in a circle? Because I'm trying to match the shape. Because when you try to match the shape, you sort of give it that texture. I deleted my highlight color. I've got blending turned on a little bit, so. Yeah, there's also different ways you can mess with the brush settings. I like to have my brushes pretty hard, because I just like that painterly style that it gives. I don't like to do mushy shading, airbrushing, that sort of thing. In Photoshop it's a different story, but in SAI I like the hard brush. So now I'm picking another lighter color that's going into the gray to try and mix them together. Okay. So now you've got the basics. These are what people mean by blocking in your shade. These are very harsh edges. Well, not very harsh, but they're hard edges. It's not really blended. It's not really shiny. It's not smooth. It doesn't have really texture. It's not blended. So now we're going to go in and start blending. Like before, I take the color. You can also use this tool. This is the tool I'm using when I hit my side button. It's just a faster way to do it, and I don't have to constantly go back and forth between the two. That's why hotkeys are so magical. So I take this color that's in between it. I might want to put my blending up a little bit. I don't ever like to put up too much. Size blending is weird. And then I just do it very lightly with my tablet. Brush over the edge. Very light touch. And I'm still going in the direction of the shape. So there's that, and then I take another color. Continue in another. You can sit here and do this for hours, just making it smooth, photorealistic, making the transitions perfect. This, I'll just do it in a vague, perfect way. Get like a smooth blend going. And with SAI, sometimes when you do the blending, it'll pick up the color there. So if I go this way, it'll bring black with it, see? So you have to sort of brush it the way you would a traditional painting. What I always say is that you can incorporate traditional drawing or painting into a digital program, but you cannot do it the other way around, really, because digital has so many shortcuts that you can use. For instance, Control Z is a magical thing, and when you use traditional work, you can always bring that into your digital work. Like how to shade a sphere. It's the same way you would shade it using charcoal. You just use your fingers instead of the digital stuff. So if you don't have a computer, if you don't have a tablet or anything, you can always practice with traditional tools. So now we're starting to get a transition, and here's my reflected light. The reflected light is never as bright as your highlight. Well, does not never. Nothing is ever never in art. You can always break the rules, and people often encourage you to break the rules, because it usually ends up looking cool. For instance, I was always told never to outline anything, but in Japan, they see lines as the default. So they think it's kind of odd that we see shade in the way a computer does. At least that's what Miyazaki said in his book. I don't know for sure. But I listen to Miyazaki, because Miyazaki's cool. So now I'm defining the edges here. I've gotten a smaller brush. I've dropped my brush size. See, I didn't even realize I did that. Once you've been at it for a while, you don't even realize you're doing this stuff. SAI, you can use the invert button, which helps to get all kinds of kinks out of your drawings. Flipping it backwards. It's the equivalent of looking at your paper through a light source to see the issues when you turn it around. So I'm sort of outlining this because I know that when you have a curved edge, it's never going to well, it's going to have sort of a shade on the edge. If you look at real curved edges, you'll notice that. So this dark color will help me later when I start shading into the highlight. And if it doesn't, I can always just erase it or paint over it. So now we've got the coarse shadow sort of shaded, so let's go into the highlighting parts. I always go for highlights last. Now when you're blending, you can also move in circular motions. It's very small, very light touch, and that will give you a shaded, blended look. I'm gonna see what I can do just by following the shape. See, I'm always choosing the colors with my little button, too. Whenever I feel like I need to change a shade, or if a shade's getting too close or too blocky, I will grab another color. Whenever you see my cursor change, I don't know if you can, but it changes. See, right there, the little cursor change. Now, I usually paint on one layer because it's just, I've always done traditional art, and that's how I've always done it. Like, I used to use 500 million layers back in the day when I was first learning how to use Photoshop and all of these, but it just, I was never able to stick to that, so I just paint on one layer. Do. Alright, let's start speeding it up. I've been kind of going slow. Now, if you're doing fur, you wouldn't have to be this precise. I'm trying to get a shiny texture on it. With fur, you could probably have just left it in the blocky stage. But this is how you get the basic shading down. See, I'm gonna make my brush even bigger. When you want to blend, you usually want to have a large brush anyway. Texture is also important. So here's, we have a shiny ball. I'm trying to make it look shiny. And then with fur, fur is dull. I did an assignment in school once where I had to draw 3 things all in one picture that had different textures. And one was a meerschaum pipe, which is a pipe carved out of some sort of like limestone, kind of like that. And a plush animal. And my plush animal was like a fox. So you have to be able to replicate those textures using the basic idea of light and shadow that you see here. So now you notice that it's got these streaky lines now because I've been doing that whole thing. When you start doing the circular motions, those lines go away. And it's gonna take forever. Like, you can just work on this for ages, make all those lines go away, making little circle motions. Use your, I'm using very light pressure on my tablet, so very light. Circular motions. And when you paint with Photoshop, you don't have this sort of blending thing going on. At least with some of the brushes. I think there are ways that you can make brushes that manipulate or change that effect. And you can have that all the time. But I normally paint with SAI. Because I use Photoshop as sort of adding the final touches. Changing colors, making everything unified looking. Color is one of the other things that I need to work on. That's another thing. When you start out drawing, you don't want to start with color, really. because you don't know how to shade. Once you know how to shade, you can just take color and throw it in, and that makes things pretty good. So I'm gonna redefine this reflected light. Now I'm gonna work on my cast shadow, which I've been neglecting, and that's bad because when you're drawing something, you want to draw a little bit of everything kind of at the same time, so you can finish it in a specific time set. That's what I was taught anyway. So the shade is always going to be shaded pretty dark, like your darkest color. And then depending on the shadow, it could just be that way all the way through, but a lot of them will fade into lighter color at the end as the light passes through or something. Some fancy scientific term. See, I can flip my canvas upside down too, that helps. If you haven't noticed, it's flipped upside down. That's another reason I like SAI, because it's just so easy to flip your canvas, and with Photoshop you have to use buttons, and I haven't memorized the hotkeys yet. That's just lazy though. I could do it if I wanted to, I guess, but I just don't have time. That's my excuse for everything. Alright, so there's that. Now, sometimes the core shadow or the cast shadow will have a highlight in the middle of it, which is reflected light off of the sphere. So it's light coming off of here and bouncing here and making a little highlight mark. So I'm going to add that. It's really prominent when you have a light or a transparent thing going on. It's like a marble or whatever. You can see through it a little bit and the light goes through it. I'm going to make that a little bit lighter. Here's where the hard edge comes in. You could shade that in, make it soft. I kind of like the hard-edged things. I like to make a defining line too. Separate the cast shadow. So there's the sphere, and now I would usually take my eraser and go in and clean up the sketchy parts. So with the eraser in SAI, I drop the opacity so that it doesn't make such harsh cuts when I erase, and I just start going around and erasing like I would with a kneaded eraser in traditional art. Just cleaning it up. I'm a subtractive? No, I'm an additive artist. So I like to add things and then take away with an eraser rather than start out drawing the places that will not be erased eventually. A lot of watercolor artists are really good at just adding color where it needs to go and leaving the white. I'm not. So, making sure the shape stays spherical. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I personally like things that are not perfect because it makes them organic. Some people like to be very specific and very photorealistic. I've tried that. It's not fun for me. Like, why would you make something photorealistic if you can just take a picture of it? Like, it shows off your creative technique. Like, well, not your creative technique, but shows off your control, but I don't know, it probably has a use somewhere. Okay, so there we have a sphere made out of the parts of light. Not perfect, but it's good enough. That's the basics of drawing a sphere. Now, adding fur in is different. So, let's see. Start off with a sort of smallish brush. And I always start with sort of a dark color and go in like this. Now, when you do fur, you have to keep in mind the way... There, I changed my color to even darker. You have to keep in mind the way the fur clings to something. So when you look at a dog's face, the fur goes in a certain direction. This is just adding texture to the sphere. I could make this turn to a rock, I could make this turn into diamond, but we're gonna make it furry. These are just sort of guidelines to give me an idea of where I want the fur to go. And we'll see, I build up, at least. Now there are different textures of fur too, of course. There's really fluffy fur and really thin fur, like on a Jack Russell, and then there's like horse fur, which is tight, close to the body so that the muscles are showing. Notice I'm not doing anything on the outside yet, that comes later. Or not, huh? Now this comes from observation and practice too. You have to look at a lot of pictures of doggies, or a lot of pictures of furry things. I have a library, not a library, but just a lot of saved pictures of furry things. And I've done a lot of furry things, so it sort of just comes from memory. But fur also follows the parts of light. So you have a tuft of fur, and it's darker on the side here than it is facing the light. Here I'm just playing around now. I don't know what's going on. We'll figure it out. That's usually how I go. If it ends up turning bad, well, you just have to go back and redo it. It's not gonna kill anybody. So, we've got that started. Let's start going in with a lighter color. As usual, I always say, leave the highlight for last. The highlight will bring things into focus that you want to bring into focus. These are neutral tones. So I sort of do the same thing. Notice I'm also following the shape of the circle. Fur will follow the shape that it's covering. So this was a shoulder, you would have the shoulder like this. Now you can always practice doing cylinders or cones or cubes this way as well. Now, I don't know if I want this to be really thick and shaggy or if I want it to be just medium, sort of regular fur. I guess we'll find out. Now, I haven't changed colors either. I'm not blending. I'm just making guidelines. This is what I use hard brushes for. See, it's 100%. I also don't have it set on the minimum size where it's teeny tiny when you sketch, because that leaves like little traces of stuff and I don't like it. Now, I'm not even sort of really thinking about it. I'm just sort of going with the way I think it will go. And as I said before, this is from practice and lots of visual reference. I just have a visual library in my brain because I've looked at so many fur things. There was one art assignment I had to do that was denim jeans. And I curled them up on a chair, my computer chair, and I sat there for like 3 days doing the jeans in as meticulous detail as I possibly could. And I started dreaming about the shade of jeans. Like, I dreamed that I was like walking around in mountains made of jeans. That's kind of what you have to have in your mind when you do shading or techniques or any sort of texture. You have to sort of dream it. It invades your mind. It never goes away. Now here I've got like a weird tuft going on, but we might be able to play with that. We'll see. Like, whenever you make a mistake or you think you made a mistake, you can always try to turn it into something that might be interesting. It might make people look at that, and that could always be something neat to play with. So we're going into the fluffy white part. Okay. Now this is for 3D shading too, just regular soft shading. There's other ways to deal with fur in cell shading. Cell shading is another beast. That's something you have to play with, because cell shading is a simplification of this sort of shading. As you notice, I'm still pulling colors out of this. I'm not going over here or dragging it. I'm always pulling out of what I've already got going on here. So let's get these midtones and start playing here. Always start with the shade or midtone. So if you start with the midtone, then you know what needs to be darker. There's a problem with starting with the shade too, in that you get too dark. Now when you draw fur, you also have to imagine it not in little strings, but in sort of clumps. Like, imagine a dog's chest, and the way that the fur sort of breaks apart into little clumps right around its neck area. That's like the most interesting part of the fur on a dog. That's what I like a lot. Here I'm finding little spots where I can make shading deeper to give it more form, I guess you could say. Now again, you can always just sit here for hours and hours and hours, building up the fur, making everything fancy looking. We'll just go with a basic detailed. And this is where commission artists put in all of their time to make things look really nice. So if you want really detailed shading, this is what they go through for your whole character. This is pretty detailed too. See, another thing I haven't done yet is gone back to check what it looks like from far away. That's something you should always do when you're doing your work, because that gives you an idea of what the thing looks like from far away, and it keeps you from being too close in one area, because you could be painting one area for 3 hours and then you go backwards and it's like, ugh, that part looks so off now. When you go back and you do that looking from the distance thing, it makes, well, it saves you lots of time for one, because you'll be like, ugh, I have to go in and change this, it doesn't look right. But it will help you in the long run. I'm sort of getting bolder with the shading here, making it darker. That's because I've gotten this down and I know, oh look, it's got to be darker. Just sort of making organic curvy shapes. See, the darker it is, the more stark it stands out in the white. It's also got a bit of a texture to it too. Like a furry texture. Nah, not that it isn't fur. Ha. Now, we're still sketching things in too. So we're not refining yet. We're sort of laying down foundations. I'm gonna have sort of the hair opening up here. Something that happens in a textured way. When you look at some dogs' noses, their fur goes in sort of interesting patterns. Now, how am I gonna do this? Let's see. Got the light color. So even with fur you can have reflected light. It's just gonna be duller. See if I can do something without erasing it. Don't want to erase it. See, now I'm starting to get shapes out of it. You've got some little lines that define the lines in the tuft, and now we're getting some shapes. This is something you sort of find as you're painting, I guess. That's how it works for me anyway. You define the shapes. You've already got a foundation down there. See, it's not very defined here. Let's look at it from my Yeah, it's still got that shiny look to it, which I don't want because fur doesn't have that. Well, some of it does, but that's not the fur that I want here. As you've noticed, I don't believe that they're absolutes for anything. So, there's always an exception to the rule. That's sort of my philosophy on art, too. You can say something isn't art, but then you see something that changes your mind. That's sort of the same as that thing that isn't art. And then you get all confused. You wonder what life means. I still haven't brought in any highlights yet. What I'm doing is what I consider just midtones and dark shades. The highlighting is always my favorite part, and that's usually where all the cool stuff happens. It's also like the last part, so I always end up looking forward to it. I don't know what sort of texture I want to have on the outside. It looks a bit like a cactus. That's okay though. Cactuses are kind of fuzzy. And I have fur laying on the ground, which is always interesting. If you have a furry ball, the shadow's gotta be furry too. I had a teacher once that told me something about how the shadow, if you do a certain angle, you can always get the shadow right. But I suck at math and anything with tangible edges, so I never got it. Okay, so that's the basic sketch for the shading. That's got the shading and the midtone in it. So now we're gonna start playing with the highlighting. See, I took this midtone in the dark area is like a highlight. So I'm still not using the lightest lights, but I'm starting to build up some more texture, making the furry parts look more furry. Now this might be too light to go into the darker spots, so I'll grab another. Now I'm trying to stay within the confines of the shapes that I've already made. Usually only making the tips go out because fur is fluffy and wiggly. You want it to be like a soft texture too. I've got a little bit of everything going on in this furry ball thing. Net. See, now I'm not making up any more of those little tufty things. I'm sort of following them, like I said before. And when I do the darker ones, I don't push as hard, because that makes the color darker. Now I grab this color to go into the darker darks. You don't want to put any highlights in the dark darks unless you're like wanting to emphasize something, or if there's a glowing thing or going on or whatever. Because when you put bright highlights in the darks, it never works out. It always looks like it's vying for attention back there. so we've got sort of something going on in the back there. It's like the fur wants to go down. Shading a circle with fur is a hard thing to do. Especially without reference. Usually I would drag up a picture, use that to give me an idea of what the heck I'm doing. When in doubt, always go look for references. So now I think I've done too much highlighting in the shady parts. So I want to go back and define the edges more. Yeah, I use references like crazy. Not for this, because there's always that whole, you're gonna get sued if you listen to this music, or if you're gonna get sued if you use this reference picture. I don't want to be sued. I don't make enough money to be sued. There, so I've defined it some more. I can probably go in and make some bigger highlights in now. Bigger brush. Let's see. See, the reflected light kind of got lost. I don't know where it went. See if I can bring it back. Okay. Let's get some high highlights here. Now see how I'm shading the tips and not the bases, or I'm trying not to anyway. Because the bases are going in to a shaded part. It's the tips that would have the highlights on them. Again with that light thing. It's also something you notice after observation for a while. Now here I'm not being too meticulous, like I could be. I could go in here and just do this for like 4 hours and make this a perfectly fluffy ball thing. But then you get to a point where too much is too much, where you've just over rendered it and things just look too perfect, too uniform, too clinical, I guess is the word I'm looking for. I like to leave things kind of messy, because the brain can kind of interpret it by itself. I'm adding some more highlights to these parts because I want these to stick out. Notice how I'm highlighting just the tips and sort of overlapping these? That gives a sense of depth. Overlapping other shaded parts. Makes it look like it's popping out. Let's check. Now we're starting to look fluffy. It's getting rid of that shiny look too, which is good. Half of art is trying to figure out what you're doing in the first place, and if it works out, that's good. I know, some people probably don't think of it that way, but I do. We've got a pretty high highlight going on. I don't know if I like that. Too much too soon. Now we have our friend trusty Control Z. There, it's a bit darker. It's another good thing about digital. It's cheaper. After you buy the whole program, you don't have to worry about buying paper or running out of ink or running out of the color, and you can draw on as many canvases as you want and throw them all away. Because it's all digital and it doesn't exist. I don't like the way this edge is turning out, so I'm gonna play around and see if I can get it to the way I like it. I have to go to work tomorrow. Good thing it's not too late. There, I like that better. Now we're digging out the highlights, the lightest lights. See why I do them last? Because you can cover up what's behind them. Make it look more three-dimensional. Now, like I mentioned before, the technique when you do cell shading is totally different. If you do this with cell shading, it's going to end up looking funky. Cell shading is a beast in and of itself. Different ways to do things. Too bright. Let's back it up. Yep, like that better. So now I'm gonna do some shapes in here. Now, unlike Shiny Ball's fur doesn't have that sparkly sparkle in the middle when the highlight goes on. If you do that, well, some fur can have it, but this fur is kind of shaggy. So it won't really have that sparkly sparkle in it. It'll have a highlight, but the sparkle won't. Just the really high looking highlight. Now I can go in and define some more of the dark shapes. This also helps define the shading and the shadows of it. This whole part doesn't even have some. We can change that. Back. Man, I wish my processor was better. I could listen to music. I hate drawing in silence. It drives me crazy. Listening to the sound of my brain thinking doesn't work very well. So, I've got a furry, fuzzy, fluffy ball. Now we can go in and add some finishing touches. This could even be like color shift from a light color to a dark color. You wouldn't know because it's in black and white. Here we're adding little straggly hairs. You don't want to add too many of these because then it looks really funky. But the straggly hairs help give another three-dimensional look to it. Adding in fluffy fluffs. There. Couldn't grab the shade I wanted. Now I could probably go in and make it darker dark here. Something somebody said I had problems with is how deep my shadows go. So let's see what happens when I do that after I add in some of these little fluffies. Now it's kind of a shaggy fluffy ball. Now, let's see, add in darker dark. Don't want to go to black. This will help define some of this muddy, dark, shady area that I don't really like. I've been staring at it and it's been bothering me. Now there are probably fancy Photoshop ways you can do this, but I always do traditional painting, sort of with digital medium. See, the only time I went in to get a color when I grabbed the dark was when I knew it was going to be a really dark color. And when using color, I would probably play around and pick a bunch of colors before I stuck with one. And I'm just using a really light touch to define some more of these fluffies. This is more refining. This is where the money comes in when you're doing commissions, is this. When you want detailed fine, this is what you get. Extra time, much more refined. Lots of thought. So it looks like my reflected light got lost in the fluffies there. I don't know if I want to bring it back. It looks okay without it. It's breaking a piece of art rules, but see, if I had reference, I would probably look at the reference to see if there's reflected light in the way that I think it is. Notice how everything's sort of in clumps. Because fur and hair even are clumpy. They don't really look stringy. There's a fluffy ball with a shadow. Now, I might go over it with a lower opacity brush and a mid-tone just to even out the sharpness. That's a problem I have. Sort of uniform it. See, it's still defined, but it's got more of a shade to it. So now you can go in and start doing stuff with the background. Usually you'd want to start the background first, not last. Background is never last. It's not a very good idea. Now you can see the definition better. But since this background's pretty simple, I went and did it last. Also, if you add in a background last, you might find your character doesn't match it, and then you have problems. Also, the background helps make your character in your picture look uniform. So if you do the background last, which is what I did here because I'm dumb, if you do it last, you might run into problems with the background not matching your character, and then it just looks all ununiformed, and it doesn't work very well. I mean, you can, but you might risk wasting time, or you can always practice. Try it out first. Get rid of this line. Get rid of the sun. See, here's a background problem. Because I went in and did the background with my shady colors. It's something you worry about when you're working on one layer. I always work on one layer. See, all of this is done on one layer except for the background. Background's always done in its own layer. Oop. I always get confused with layers too, so that's why I always avoid it. Using more layers, I mean, that's what I avoid. So, the background. This could probably use some more definition. And here's what I mean when I crop it. Could probably move it too. Play with the composition a little bit. There's some more composition playing, yay! Just giving very faint sort of halo. I don't even know if it looks good. But I did it. See, with a tablet and the pen pressure, you can always have a lighter color, but if it's still too light, you can always lower the opacity. The opacity is meant to be lowered. And yeah, it's got a bit of a glow now. So now you have a fluff ball, and that's how I paint fur. Now, if you wanted to throw color on it, you could play with the overlay. Say you want it to be warm, make it red, pinkish color. Let's see, that's so bright. Now, let's do a little grayer. So, now you've got sort of a pinkish colored fluff ball. Some artists will go with the overlay and just do this the whole time. I don't really like it. Like, I'd like to define my colors with it. Like, for example, see, the dark is blue. Turning the dark blue makes it easy. This is a huge time saver if you're into making art for commission. Using the overlay and then just shading it that way. I always feel like I'm just not very good at using it, I guess. You can make a higher highlight. Lots of artists can do some really cool stuff using this technique. I'm not one of them. I might practice it more and see if I can master it, but for now I like to do it the way I've done it for quite a long time. So yeah, you can add green in if you want. Make it green a little bit, give it a some marking. Say you've got a green stripe on your muzzle or something. Here's a good way to do it really easily. There you go. Color on, color off, color on, color off. And you can always adjust it too. I would go in Photoshop and adjust the hue and saturation and stuff. Play around with it. Make it look cool. But yeah, that's a final. See, it's kind of dull, so when you add the color, saturation, and the brightness, usually makes it look good. Some contrast, some color deepen. You can play around with that, see if you like it. See, that makes it look more interesting. But yeah, so that's how you paint a fluffy ball, and how I do fur. And that's it. I guess I should probably sign it. Woo! So there. Yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something.